Hello, welcome to Blacktop Files. Tonight we bring you a collection of accounts from rangers who patrol some of the wettest, darkest, and most isolated terrain in the continental United States. These are long-form horror stories that feel like true accounts from across America, and tonight we're focused on the rainforests of Washington State, where the canopy is so thick that daylight barely reaches the ground, where fog can erase entire hillsides in seconds, and where the distance between you and help can be measured in days, not hours. The Pacific Northwest has always had a reputation for strangeness. The density of the trees, the constant presence of moisture in the air, the way sound travels differently under that much green. All of it creates conditions that make even experienced rangers second-guess what they see and hear. But what makes these particular cases especially disturbing is the consistency. Different rangers, different districts, different years, and yet the patterns line up in ways that are hard to ignore. Some of these men spent decades in those forests and never talked about what they experienced until recently. Others left the service entirely and refused to go back, even for recreation. If you want more horror that feels uncomfortably real, make sure to subscribe to Blacktop Files, turn on notifications so you never miss a file, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from tonight, whether that's a city apartment or somewhere a little closer to the trees. Let's start with a patrol route that seemed routine until the fog rolled in and refused to leave. I started working for the Forest Service in the early 90s, right out of college. I thought I knew what I was getting into. I'd grown up camping, done some volunteer trail work, spent summers in the Cascades. But working in the Hoh rainforest is different. It's not just hiking. It's not just being outdoors. It's living inside a landscape that feels older and stranger than anything you've trained for, and after a while, you start to notice things that don't fit the manual. My district covered about 40 square miles of temperate rainforest on the western edge of the Olympic Peninsula. Most of it was old growth, Sitka spruce and western hemlock that had been standing for centuries, some of them 15 feet across at the base. The canopy was so dense that even on clear days, the light that reached the ground was dim and green, filtered through hundreds of feet of leaves and moss. The moss itself grew on everything. It hung from branches in curtains, covered the trunks in layers a foot thick, carpeted the ground so completely that you couldn't see the soil. When it rained, which was most of the time, the whole forest dripped for hours after the clouds moved on. You learned to accept being wet. You learned to accept the quiet. The quiet was the first thing that got to people. The forest absorbed sound in a way that made everything feel muffled and close. Could be standing 10 feet from a creek and barely hear it. You could call out and your voice wouldn't carry. It made radio communication tricky, and it made you aware of just how alone you were once you got more than a mile from the ranger station. We patrolled in pairs when we could, but there were times, especially in the off-season, when staffing was thin and you'd be out there by yourself for days. That's how it was in November of '94, when I got sent out to check on a section of trail near the Hoh River. We'd had reports of a washout after a storm the week before, and I needed to assess whether we could reroute foot traffic or if we needed to close the trail entirely until spring. It was supposed to be a 2-day trip. I packed light, standard gear, tent, stove, water filter, radio, first aid kit, maps, and a notebook for logging conditions. The weather forecast was typical for that time of year. Rain mist, temperatures in the low 40s. I'd done the same kind of trip a dozen times. I left the station just after dawn and made good time for the first few hours. The trail followed the river for a while, then cut inland through a stretch of forest that was mostly hemlock and fern. The ground was soft, centuries of decomposition turning everything into a spongy black mat that swallowed your footsteps. I stopped for lunch around noon, ate some jerky and trail mix, checked my map, and kept moving. I wanted to reach the washout site before dark so I could set up camp and start the assessment fresh in the morning. I got there around 4. The washout was worse than I'd expected. A section of hillside had come down during the storm, taking about 30 feet of trail with it. The dirt and debris had piled up against a cluster of downed trees, and the runoff had carved a new channel through the area, turning the trail into a muddy ravine. I took some photos, made notes about the gradient and the stability of the slope, and marked the location on my map. It was clear we'd need to close the trail and possibly bring in a crew with tools to rebuild the route higher up the hill, but that would have to wait until I got back and filed my report. By the time I finished, the light was fading. I found a flat spot about 50 yards from the washout, far enough from the new runoff that I wouldn't have to worry about water, and set up my tent. I got the stove going, boiled some water for dinner, and ate while the sky turned from gray to black. The rain had stopped, but the forest was still dripping. I could hear it all around me, a constant patter of water falling from the canopy onto the moss below. It was the only sound. I crawled into my tent around 8 and tried to read for a while by flashlight, but I was tired from the hike and the report, and I fell asleep before 9. I don't know how long I was out before I woke up. It wasn't a noise that woke me. It was the absence of noise. The dripping had stopped completely. I lay there in my sleeping bag, staring at the dark fabric of the tent, and listened. Nothing. No wind, no water, no distant cracks of branches settling. Just silence. I unzipped the tent and looked outside. The forest was wrapped in fog, thick and white and so dense that I couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. My flashlight beam didn't penetrate it. It just reflected back at me, turning the air into a glowing wall. I stepped out of the tent and stood there for a minute, trying to orient myself. The fog was cold and damp, and it smelled like wet earth and moss, but there was something else underneath it. Something faint and stale, like old wood or standing water. I told myself it was just weather. Fog was normal in the rainforest, especially in November, but the silence wasn't normal. Even in fog, you should be able to hear something. Wind moving through the trees, water dripping, your own breathing echoing back. This was different. This felt like the forest had stopped. I went back into the tent and checked my watch. It was a little after midnight. I tried the radio just to see if I could raise the station, but all I got was static. That wasn't unusual. The terrain and the canopy made radio contact spotty at best, and in fog it was worse. I told myself I'd try again in the morning and tried to go back to sleep. I didn't succeed. I lay there for hours, listening to the silence, feeling the weight of the fog pressing in from all sides. When I finally did fall asleep, I dreamed I was walking through the forest following a trail I didn't recognize. The fog was still there, but in the dream it was moving, flowing between the trees like water. I could see shapes in it, tall and thin and motionless, and I had the sense that they were watching me. I woke up sweating, my heart pounding, and it took me a moment to realize I was still in my tent. The silence was still there. I got up at dawn, or what I assumed was dawn. The fog hadn't lifted. If anything, it was thicker. I couldn't see my tent from 10 feet away. I packed up my gear, ate a cold breakfast, and tried to retrace my steps back to the trail. It should have been easy. I'd camped less than 50 yards from the washout site, and the trail itself was a clear line through the forest, worn down by decades of foot traffic. but I couldn't find it. I walked in what I thought was the right direction, counting my steps, checking my compass, and I came to a stop in front of a wall of ferns and moss-covered logs. No trail, no washout, just forest. I tried again, adjusting my angle, moving slower, checking my map. Nothing. I told myself I was disoriented, that the fog was playing tricks on my sense of direction, but I'd been doing this work for years. I knew how to navigate in poor visibility. I knew how to read terrain, and I couldn't find something I'd camped next to the night before. I spent the next 2 hours searching. I found my campsite again, twice, but I couldn't find the trail, I couldn't find the washout. I couldn't find the river, which should have been less than half a mile to the west. Every direction looked the same. Trees, moss, ferns, fog. I tried the radio again and got nothing but static. I tried shouting, hoping maybe another ranger or a hiker might hear me, but my voice didn't carry. It sounded small and flat, like the fog was swallowing it before it could travel. By mid-morning, I was starting to feel the edges of panic. I forced myself to stop, to sit down on a log and think. I had food for another day, maybe 2 if I stretched it. I had water, I had my gear. I wasn't in immediate danger. The fog would lift eventually, and when it did, I'd be able to see landmarks and navigate out. I just needed to stay calm and stay put. That's when I saw the first one. It was standing about 20 feet away, just at the edge of where the fog turned solid. It looked like a tree at first, tall and narrow and dark, but it was too straight, too smooth. I stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of the shape, and then I realized it wasn't a tree. It was a figure. A person maybe, or something shaped like a person, but wrong. Too tall, too thin, and completely motionless. I couldn't see any details. The fog blurred everything, but I could see the outline, and I could feel it looking at me. I stood up slowly, not taking my eyes off it. I called out, asked if they needed help, if they were lost. No response. The figure didn't move. I took a step toward it, and it was gone. Not like it walked away or ducked behind a tree. Just gone, like it had been absorbed back into the fog. I stood there for a long time, my pulse hammering in my ears, telling myself I'd imagined it. Fatigue, stress, the disorientation from the fog, it was all playing tricks on me. I sat back down and tried to focus on something concrete. I checked my gear, counted my supplies, wrote notes in my notebook about the conditions and the time. Anything to keep my mind occupied. I saw the second, 1 hour later. This time it was closer, maybe 10 feet away, standing between 2 large hemlocks. Same shape, same impossible stillness. I didn't call out this time, I just watched it, and it watched me, and then it was gone. By the time I saw the third one, I'd stopped trying to rationalize it. There were more of them now, scattered through the fog, standing at different distances, always just at the edge of visibility. They didn't move. They didn't make sounds. They were just there, and they were watching. I stayed in one spot for the rest of the day, my back against a tree, my knife in my hand even though I didn't know what I'd do with it. I didn't see the figures again, but I felt them. I felt their presence in the silence, in the weight of the fog, in the way the forest seemed to be holding its breath. The fog lifted sometime during the night. I didn't see it happen. I fell asleep sitting up, too exhausted to stay awake. And when I opened my eyes, it was dawn and the air was clear. I could see the trees, the ferns, the moss, all of it sharp and bright and normal. I could hear the forest again, the dripping, the distant sound of the river, the creak of branches. I found the trail in less than 5 minutes. The washout was exactly where I'd left it. I hiked back to the station that morning, filed my report, and didn't mention the fog or the figures. I told my supervisor the washout needed a crew and a closure, and he thanked me and sent me home for a few days. I didn't go back to that section of the forest for the rest of the season. When I finally did, months later, it was with another ranger and we didn't stay overnight. I kept working for the Forest Service for another 8 years, but I requested transfers twice to get out of that district. I never saw the figures again, but I never stopped thinking about them. I still don't know what they were. I don't know if they were real or if the isolation and the fog did something to my head. But I know the silence wasn't normal, and I know I wasn't alone out there, even when I should have been. The next file comes from a ranger who spent 15 years managing a remote station near Lake Quinault and learned that some visitors don't leave, even after the season ends. I worked out of a small ranger station on the southern edge of the Quinault rainforest from 2001 to 2016. It was a solo posting most of the year, just me and a part-time volunteer during the busy summer months. The station was old, built sometime in the 60s, a single-room cabin with a wood stove, a desk, a radio setup, and a cot in the back. It sat at the end of a gravel road about 3 miles from the nearest paved highway, surrounded by old-growth forest and close enough to the lake that you could hear the water on calm nights. The job was mostly routine. I checked permits, maintained trails, logged wildlife sightings, and helped the occasional lost hiker find their way back to the main routes. During the winter, when the roads were muddy and the tourists were gone, I spent a lot of time alone, reading, doing paperwork, and keeping the station functional. It was quiet work, and I liked it. I'd always preferred being in the woods to being around people, and the solitude suited me. The station had a logbook that went back decades, a thick binder where rangers recorded daily notes, maintenance issues, and unusual incidents. I'd read through it during my first few weeks on the job, partly out of curiosity and partly because it helped me learn the history of the area. Most of the entries were mundane, trail reports, weather conditions, supply orders, but there were a few that stood out. Small things mostly. Notes about finding campsites that didn't match any permits. Reports of hearing voices or footsteps near the station at night. One entry from the 80s mentioned a ranger who'd quit after a single season, saying he couldn't sleep there anymore. No details, just that line and then nothing. I didn't think much of it at the time. People get spooked in remote places. The forest is full of sounds that can seem strange if you're not used to them. Wind, animals, branches rubbing together, it all creates noise. And when you're alone, your brain starts looking for patterns. I figured the previous rangers had just been more susceptible to that kind of thinking than I was. The first thing I noticed was the knocking. It started in late October of my first year, about a month after the volunteer season ended, and I was alone at the station full-time. I was sitting at the desk one evening, filling out a report when I heard it. 3 slow knocks, deliberate and evenly spaced, coming from the direction of the door. I looked up, assuming someone had come by, maybe a late-season hiker or a local who needed directions. I opened the door and there was no one there. The gravel road was empty. The forest was still. I stepped outside and looked around, checked. The sides of the station called out and got no response. I went back inside and told myself it was a branch or a piece of loose siding, something shifting in the wind. But there was no wind that night. The air was dead calm. The knocking came back 2 nights later. Same pattern, 3 slow knocks, same location, the front door. I opened it faster this time, thinking maybe I'd catch whoever it was, but again, no one. I walked out to the road with a flashlight and swept the area. Nothing. No footprints in the soft gravel, no sounds of movement, No signs that anyone had been there. It became a regular thing. Every few nights, sometimes twice in one night, I'd hear the knocking. Always 3 knocks, always the same rhythm, always from the door. I started keeping a log of it, writing down the dates and times, trying to see if there was a pattern. There wasn't. It was random, or at least it seemed random. I checked the outside of the station during the day, looking for loose boards or anything that might explain the sound, but everything was solid. After a while, I stopped opening the door. I'd hear the knocks, I'd note the time, and I'd go back to whatever I was doing. It was easier to ignore it than to keep getting up and finding nothing. I told myself it was just part of living in an old building in the middle of the woods, one of those things you get used to. Then I started hearing the footsteps. It was early December, and the first snow of the season had fallen the night before. Just a light dusting, enough to cover the ground, but not enough to stick to the trees. I was chopping wood behind the station when I heard them. Slow, heavy footsteps, crunching through the snow. They were coming from the direction of the forest, moving toward the station. I stopped and listened, expecting to see someone emerge from the trees, maybe a hiker who'd gotten turned around. But no one appeared. The footsteps kept coming, getting closer, and then they stopped. I waited, axe in hand, staring at the tree line. Nothing. No movement, no sounds, no signs of anyone. I walked over to where the footsteps had seemed to stop and looked at the snow. There were no tracks. The snow was smooth and undisturbed, no sign that anything had walked through it. I went back to chopping wood, but I kept glancing over my shoulder. The footsteps didn't come back that day, but I heard them again that night while I was inside the station. They circled the building, slow and deliberate, moving from the back to the front, then stopping at the door. 3 knocks. I didn't open it. Over the next few weeks, it escalated. The knocking became more frequent, sometimes 4 or 5 times a night. The footsteps became a nightly occurrence, always circling the station, always stopping at the door. I started hearing other sounds too, scratching on the walls, faint and rhythmic, like fingernails on wood, tapping on the windows, soft but persistent, and voices, low and indistinct, coming from just outside the walls. I could never make out what they were saying, but I could hear the cadence, the rise and fall of conversation, like people talking just out of earshot. I tried the radio, contacted the main office, and mentioned that I was hearing strange noises at night. The dispatcher asked if I wanted someone to come out and check the area, but I said no. I didn't know what I'd tell them. I didn't have any evidence. No tracks, no damage, no signs of trespassing, just sounds. They'd think I was losing it, and maybe I was. I went through the logbook again, looking for similar entries. I found one from 2000 written by the ranger who'd been there before me. He'd noted hearing knocking and footsteps during his first winter, and had written that he'd searched the area multiple times but found nothing. He'd concluded it was probably animals or acoustic tricks caused by the terrain. The entry ended with a line that stuck with me. Recommend future rangers avoid staying overnight during extended solo postings if possible. I didn't have that option. It was my job to be there, and I wasn't going to leave just because I was hearing things. But I stopped sleeping well. I'd lie on the cot, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds outside. The knocking, the footsteps, the scratching, the voices. It felt like the station was under siege, like something was trying to get in. In January, I saw the first figure. I was outside at dusk, bringing in firewood, when I saw it standing at the edge of the clearing, maybe 30 yards away. It was tall, taller than any person should be, and it was standing perfectly still, facing the station. The light was fading, and I couldn't make out any details, just the shape, dark and thin and motionless. I stared at it for a long time, waiting for it to move or for my eyes to adjust and reveal what it actually was. It didn't move. I went inside, locked the door, and didn't come out until morning. The next night, there were two of them. Different positions, same stillness. By the end of the week, I was seeing them every night, scattered around the clearing, always just at the edge of the trees, always watching. I stopped going outside after dark. I kept the curtains closed, kept the stove going, kept the radio on just to have some noise. The sounds continued. Knocking footsteps, scratching voices. And now, occasionally, I'd hear something else. A low rhythmic sound, almost like breathing, coming from just outside the walls. I lasted until February. I put in a request for a transfer, citing personal reasons, and they approved it without question. I packed up my gear, locked the station, and drove out on a gray morning with freezing rain turning the road to mud. I didn't look back. I heard later that the ranger who replaced me lasted 3 months before requesting his own transfer. The one after that lasted 2. The station's been staffed on a rotating basis ever since, no one staying longer than a season. The official reason is budget constraints and staffing flexibility. But I've talked to a few of the rangers who've been through there, and they all mention the sounds. The knocking, the footsteps, the figures at the edge of the clearing. I don't know what's out there. I don't know if it's something in the forest or something about the station itself. Some quality of the place that makes you see and hear things that aren't there. But I know I wasn't imagining it. And I know I'll never go back. What happened to him might sound like a one-off, but this next narrator learned that the same isolation can reveal things that shouldn't be walking the trails at all. I was assigned to the Ho district in 2008 as part of a wilderness patrol rotation. My job was to hike long sections of backcountry trail, check on campsites, make sure people were following permit regulations, and report on trail conditions and wildlife activity. It was good work, physically demanding, but rewarding, and it kept me out in the forest for days at a time. I'd usually go out on a Monday and come back on a Friday, covering anywhere from 30 to 50 miles depending on the route. Most of the trails I patrolled were in the interior of the rainforest, far from the roads and the visitor centers. These were routes that saw maybe a few dozen people a year, mostly serious backpackers and the occasional research team. The terrain was rough, steep climbs, river crossings, dense undergrowth, and the weather was unpredictable. You had to be self-sufficient out there. If something went wrong, you were a long way from help. In late September of that year, I was assigned a route that took me deep into the southern part of the district, following a trail that paralleled a creek drainage for about 15 miles, before looping back through a high ridge. It was a 3-day trip, and the forecast was clear, which was unusual for that time of year. I packed light, just the essentials, and set out early on a Wednesday morning. The first day was uneventful. I made good time, checked a few campsites, saw some elk sign but no people. The forest was in that transitional phase between summer and fall, the ferns starting to yellow, the air cooler, the light softer. I camped that night near the creek, ate a freeze-dried meal, and fell asleep to the sound of water moving over rocks. The second day started the same. I broke camp at dawn, filtered some water, and headed up the trail toward the ridge. The route got steeper as the morning went on, switchbacking up through dense stands of Douglas fir and hemlock. By midday, I was above the creek, moving along a narrow trail that hugged the side of the slope. The canopy was thinner up there, and I could see patches of sky through the trees. That's when I found the camp. It was set up in a small clearing about 10 yards off the trail, partially hidden by a cluster of young cedars. There was a tent, dark green and old-looking, and a tarp strung between two trees. A backpack was leaning against a log, and there was a fire ring with fresh ashes in it. I called out, announced myself as a ranger, and waited. No response. I walked into the clearing and looked around. The tent was zipped shut. I called out again, louder this time, and knocked on one of the tent poles. Still nothing. I unzipped the tent and looked inside. It was empty. Sleeping bag, pad, some gear neatly arranged, but no person. I checked the rest of the camp. The backpack was packed, the tarp was tied down, everything was in order, but there was no sign of whoever had been staying there. I looked at the permit tag that should have been attached to the tent or the pack. There wasn't one. That wasn't unusual. People camped without permits sometimes, especially in the backcountry, where enforcement was sporadic. I made a note of the location and planned to mention it in my report, but something about the camp felt off. It was too neat, too organized, like it had been set up and then abandoned. The ashes in the fire ring were cold but recent, maybe a day old. The tent showed no signs of damage or disturbance. It looked like whoever had been there had just walked away in the middle of their trip. I spent a few minutes searching the area, looking for footprints or signs of which direction they might have gone. I found nothing. The ground around the camp was soft moss and duff, and it didn't hold tracks well, but I should have seen something, a scuff mark, a broken branch, anything. It was like they'd vanished. I decided to continue my patrol and check back on the way down. If the camp was still there and still empty, I'd report it as a possible missing person situation. I took a photo of the site, marked the location on my GPS, and kept hiking. The trail climbed for another 2 hours before cresting the ridge. The views up there were incredible, miles of green forest stretching in every direction. The peaks of the Olympics visible to the north. I stopped for lunch, ate some jerky and crackers, and checked my map. I was making good time. I'd reach my turnaround point by mid-afternoon and be back at the abandoned camp by evening. As I was packing up, I saw someone on the trail below me. It was a man, I think, though at that distance it was hard to tell. He was moving up the trail, heading in my direction. I watched him for a minute, expecting him to get closer, but he stopped. Just stopped, maybe 100 yards down the slope, and stood there. I waved, called out, asked if he needed help. He didn't respond, he didn't move. He just stood there, facing me. I felt a prickle of unease. It's not unusual to encounter other hikers in the backcountry, but his behavior was strange. I waited, watching him, and after a few minutes, I started down the trail toward him. I figured maybe he was injured or disoriented, and I wanted to check. But as I got closer, he turned and walked off the trail into the trees. I called out again, louder this time, but he didn't stop. He just kept walking, moving between the trunks, and then he was gone. I reached the spot where he'd been standing and looked around. There was no sign of him. No footprints, no broken branches, no sounds of movement. The forest was silent. I stood there for a long time, scanning the trees, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. He'd been there, I'd seen him. But now he was gone, and there was no evidence he'd ever existed. I told myself I was tired, that the altitude and the exertion were playing tricks on me. I drank some water, ate a granola bar, and kept moving. But the unease didn't go away. It sat in my chest, heavy and cold, and it stayed with me for the rest of the day. I reached my turnaround point around 3 and started back down the trail. I kept my eyes open, scanning the forest, looking for the man I'd seen or for any other signs of people. I didn't see anything. The forest was empty, quiet, still. I reached the abandoned camp just before dusk. It was exactly as I'd left it. The tent, the tarp, the backpack, all untouched. I called out again, checked the tent, searched the area. Nothing had changed. Whoever had been there was still gone. I didn't want to camp near the site. Something about it felt wrong, like I was intruding on something I wasn't supposed to see. I hiked another mile down the trail and set up my tent in a flat spot near the creek. I ate a cold dinner, not wanting to bother with the stove, and tried to relax. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I heard the footsteps around midnight. I was lying in my tent, half asleep, when I heard them. Slow, deliberate footsteps, crunching through the undergrowth. They were close, maybe 20 feet away, circling my tent. I sat up, my heart pounding, and listened. The footsteps stopped. I waited, holding my breath, and then they started again, moving in the opposite direction. I unzipped my tent and looked outside. The forest was dark. No moon, no stars. I could barely see the trees. I called out, identified myself as a ranger, demanded to know who was there. No response. The footsteps stopped again, and the silence that followed was absolute. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, sitting up in my tent, my knife in my hand. The footsteps didn't come back, but I could feel something out there, just beyond the edge of the light from my headlamp. Watching, waiting. At dawn, I packed up as fast as I could and hiked out. I didn't stop, didn't look back, didn't check the abandoned camp again. I just wanted to get back to the trailhead, back to my truck, back to somewhere with people and noise and light. I filed a report about the abandoned camp when I got back to the station. A search team went out a few days later and found the site, but the tent and gear were gone. No trace of them, no sign they'd ever been there. They searched the area for a missing person but found nothing. No body, no evidence, no reports of anyone failing to return from a trip. It was like the whole thing had been erased. I kept working in the district for another 2 years, but I never went back to that trail. I told my supervisor I preferred other routes, cited trail conditions and access issues, and he didn't push. But the truth is, I couldn't go back. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to see, that I'd crossed into some part of the forest where the rules were different. I still think about the man on the trail. I still think about the footsteps circling my tent. I don't know what they were, and I don't think I want to know. Another account from the same region suggests that whatever is out there doesn't care about experience, training, or how well you think you know the terrain. I spent 12 years working in the Quinault district before I transferred to a desk job in Olympia. People ask me why I left, and I usually tell them I wanted a change of pace, that I was getting older and the physical demands of the field were starting to wear on me. That's partly true, but the real reason is I stopped feeling safe out there. And once that feeling takes hold, you can't do the job anymore. I was part of a search and rescue team that operated out of the main ranger station near Lake Quinault. We covered a huge area, hundreds of square miles of rainforest, alpine zones, river valleys, and old logging roads. Most of our calls were routine: lost day hikers, sprained ankles, people who'd wandered off trail and needed help finding their way back. But every few years, we'd get a case that didn't make sense. Someone who vanished without a trace, or someone who was found but couldn't explain what had happened to them. In the spring of 2010, we got a call about a missing woman. She was a solo hiker, early 30s, experienced, with a solid track record of long-distance trips. She'd filed a permit for a 4-day loop in the interior of the forest, and when she didn't return by her scheduled checkout date, Her emergency contact called it in. We mobilized the next morning. The search started at the trailhead where her car was parked. We divided the route into segments and sent teams out to cover each section, checking campsites, trail junctions, and water sources. The weather had been clear for the past week, and the trail conditions were good, so we were optimistic. Most missing hikers turn up within the first 24 hours, usually because they took a wrong turn or decided to extend their trip without updating their permit. But she didn't turn up. We spent 3 days searching the entire route she'd planned, then expanded the search to adjacent trails and off-trail areas. We brought in dogs, checked every campsite, every creek crossing, every spot where someone might stop to rest or set up a tent. We found nothing. No gear, no footprints, no signs of disturbance. It was like she'd walked into the forest and disappeared. On the 4th day, we found her. She was sitting on a log about 2 miles off her planned route, deep in an area of old growth that was difficult to access. She was alive, uninjured, but she wasn't responsive. She was staring straight ahead, her hands folded in her lap, her backpack at her feet. We called out to her, identified ourselves, and she didn't react. We approached slowly, checked her vitals, and she seemed physically fine. No signs of dehydration, no injuries, no obvious medical issues. But she wouldn't speak. She wouldn't look at us. She just sat there, staring at the trees. We carried her out on a stretcher and took her to the hospital in Forks. The doctors ran tests, kept her overnight for observation, and found nothing wrong with her. She was healthy, well-nourished, showing no signs of trauma or exposure, but she still wouldn't talk. She'd respond to basic questions with nods or shakes of her head, but she wouldn't explain where she'd been or what had happened. After 2 days, her family took her home and we closed the case as a recovery. I didn't think much of it at the time. People react to stress in different ways. Maybe she'd gotten lost, panicked, and shut down mentally. Maybe the isolation had triggered something psychological. It wasn't my job to figure that out. My job was to find her, and we had. But then it happened again. In the summer of 2012, we got another call about a missing hiker. This time it was a man in his 40s, also experienced, also solo. He'd been doing a week-long trip through the same general area where we'd found the woman 2 years earlier. He missed his checkout date, and we launched a search. Same process, same teams, same thorough grid coverage. And just like before, we found nothing for the first 3 days. On the 4th day, we found him sitting on a log, less than a mile from where we'd found the woman. Same posture, same unresponsive stare, same lack of injuries or signs of distress. We brought him out, took him to the hospital, and got the same results. Physically fine, mentally unreachable. He wouldn't talk about what had happened. He wouldn't even acknowledge that anything had happened. He just stared, and after a few days, his family took him home. That's when I started asking questions. I went back through our case files, looking for similar incidents. I found 4 more cases over the previous 15 years. All solo hikers, all experienced, all found in the same general area after multi-day searches, all unresponsive or unwilling to talk about their experiences. None of them had been injured. None of them had been exposed to the elements long enough to cause medical issues. They'd just been sitting in the forest waiting to be found. I brought it up with my supervisor, suggested that maybe there was something about that area that was causing problems. Bad terrain, confusing trail markers, something environmental. He listened, thanked me for the research, and told me it was probably just coincidence. People get disoriented in the backcountry all the time, and some of them handle it worse than others. but I couldn't let it go. I started mapping the locations where we'd found these people, and I noticed they formed a rough line, about 1.5 miles long, running east to west through a section of old-growth forest that didn't have any trails. It wasn't a perfect line, but it was close enough to be noticeable. I hiked out there on my day off, wanting to see the area for myself. It looked like every other part of the rainforest. Massive trees, thick moss, ferns, logs, the usual. But there was something about the light. It was dimmer there, even in the middle of the day, like the canopy was thicker or the trees were positioned in a way that blocked more sun. And the sounds were different, muted, flatter. I stood there for a while, just listening, and I realized I couldn't hear the creek that I knew was less than 1/4 mile away. I couldn't hear birds. I couldn't hear wind. I walked along the line I'd mapped, checking the spots where we'd found people. There was nothing to see. No markers, no structures, no signs that anything unusual had ever happened there. But the silence followed me the whole way, and the light stayed dim, and by the time I reached the end of the line, I felt like I'd been holding my breath for an hour. I didn't go back to that area after that. When we got search calls in that part of the district, I volunteered for other routes. I told myself it was because I wanted to spread my experience across the team, give other people a chance to lead. But the truth was, I didn't want to find another person sitting on a log, staring at nothing, unable or unwilling to tell me what they'd seen. I left the field in 2014. I've been working at a desk ever since, coordinating logistics and training new rangers. It's fine work, it's safe work. But sometimes I think about those people, and I wonder what they saw out there that made them stop talking. I wonder if they're still thinking about it, still seeing it every time they close their eyes. I don't think I want to know. This next file involves a maintenance crew that spent too many nights near the old-growth groves and started noticing that their tools weren't the only things moving in the dark. I worked on a trail maintenance crew in the Ho district from 2005 to 2009. It was seasonal work, spring through fall, and the job was straightforward. Clear down trees, repair drainage, rebuild eroded sections of trail, replace signs and bridges, and keep the routes accessible for hikers. We worked in crews of 3 or 4, and we'd spend weeks at a time in the backcountry, camping near our work sites and moving from section to section as we finished each job. Most of the work was hard but satisfying. You'd see immediate results. A clear trail where there'd been a tangle of blown-down timber, a solid footbridge where there'd been a muddy scramble. The crew I worked with was good. Experienced guys who knew the forest and knew their tools. We had a rhythm, and the days passed quickly, but there were some sites that felt wrong from the start. In the summer of 2007, we were assigned to rebuild a section of trail in the interior of the district, about 8 miles from the nearest road. The area was old growth, some of the biggest trees in the forest, and the trail cut through a section where the canopy was so dense that you needed a headlamp to work even at noon. The ground was soft and uneven, centuries of rot and moss, and the humidity was so high that your clothes never fully dried. We set up our base camp about 1/4 mile from the work site, a flat spot near a creek where we could filter water and have some space between us and the trail. There were 3 of us on that rotation. Myself, my crew lead, and a seasonal hire who'd been with us for about a month. We planned to spend 2 weeks there, working on the trail during the day and camping at night. The first few days were normal. We cut timber, cleared brush, reset some bog bridges that had shifted over the winter. The work was slow because of the terrain, but we made progress. The only thing that stood out was how quiet it was. We were deep enough in the forest that we didn't see any hikers, and the usual animal sounds, birds, squirrels, rustling in the undergrowth, were almost non-existent. It was just the sound of our tools and the occasional drip of water from the canopy. On the fourth night, we started noticing things moving in the camp. We'd stored our tools and gear in a pile near the edge of the clearing, covered with a tarp to keep the moisture off. In the morning, we'd find the tarp pulled back and the tools rearranged. Small things at first. A shovel leaning against a different tree. A saw move from one side of the pile to the other. We figured it was an animal, maybe a bear or a raccoon, though we hadn't seen any sign of either. We started securing the tarp with rocks and bungee cords, and the disturbances stopped for a couple of nights. Then we started hearing the sounds. It was the seasonal hire who mentioned it first. He said he'd been woken up by footsteps circling his tent, slow and deliberate, like someone pacing. He'd unzipped his tent and looked out, but he hadn't seen anything. The crew lead said he'd heard something similar the night before, but had assumed it was one of us getting up to use the bathroom. I hadn't heard anything, but that night I did. It was around 2 a.m, and I woke up to the sound of movement outside my tent. Not footsteps exactly, but something brushing against the fabric, sliding along the side like a hand or a branch. I lay there listening, and the sound moved from one side of the tent to the other, then stopped at the entrance. I waited, not moving, barely breathing, and after what felt like an hour, the sound moved away. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At breakfast, the crew lead mentioned hearing the same thing, and the seasonal hire said his tent had been touched as well. We talked about animals, about wind, about the possibility that our exhaustion was making us hypersensitive to normal forest sounds, but none of us believed it. The sounds had been too deliberate, too focused. That day, while we were working, we found something strange on the trail. It was a pattern carved into the bark of a massive Sitka spruce about 20 yards from our work site. It looked like a series of lines and circles, arranged in a way that didn't seem random, but didn't make any obvious sense either. The marks were old, weathered, the bark starting to grow over them, but they were still visible. We stood there for a while, trying to figure out what it was. A surveyor's mark, maybe, or something left by a previous crew. But it didn't match any standard symbols we knew, and it felt too intentional to be natural. We took a photo and kept working, but the discovery unsettled us. Over the next few days, we found more of the patterns. Different trees, different locations, but always the same basic design, lines radiating from a central circle. They were scattered along the trail, sometimes visible from the path, sometimes hidden behind logs or buried in the moss. We counted 11 of them before we stopped looking. The disturbances in the camp got worse. Tools would disappear and turn up in odd places, stuck in the ground in the middle of the clearing, leaning against trees, far from where we'd left them, arranged in patterns that mirrored the carvings we'd found on the trail. Our food, stored in bear canisters, was untouched, but the canisters were moved, rolled away from the camp and left in the woods. We started packing up everything we weren't using and keeping it in our tents at night, but that didn't stop it. On the 10th night, the crew lead decided we were leaving. He didn't explain his reasoning, just said we'd done enough work on that section and it was time to move to the next site. The seasonal hire didn't argue, and neither did I. We packed up the camp that morning, loaded our gear, and hiked out. The trail we'd been working on was about 70% complete, and we never went back to finish it. When we got back to the ranger station, the crew lead filed a report about the site, noting the carvings and the disturbances and recommending that future crews avoid camping in that area. I don't know if anyone followed up on it. I left the crew at the end of that season and took a job with the Park Service in Oregon. I still think about those carvings. I still think about the tools arranged in patterns, the footsteps circling the tents, the way the forest felt like it was pressing in on us every night. I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was people or something else. But I know we weren't welcome there, and I know we were right to leave. What he experienced might have seemed isolated, but this next ranger found that some sections of the forest have patterns that go back longer than any of the records. I transferred to the Olympic National Forest Archives in 2015 after spending 8 years in the field. My job was to digitize old records, reports, maps, permits, incident logs, anything that had been stored on paper and needed to be preserved electronically. It was quiet work, and it suited me after years of physical labor and long patrols. Most of the documents were routine: logs of trail maintenance, permit applications, wildlife surveys, budgets and supply orders. But every so often, I'd come across something that stood out. A report that didn't fit the usual patterns. A note scrawled in the margin of a map. A case file that had been marked incomplete and filed away without resolution. One of the first things I noticed was a recurring reference to a specific area in the southern part of the Ho district. It appeared in documents going back to the 1940s, always in connection with incidents that were described as unusual or unexplained. Missing hikers, abandoned campsites, rangers requesting transfers after working in that area, search and rescue operations that ended without finding the person but with notes about strange conditions or inconsistencies in the timeline. I started pulling every document that mentioned the area and organizing them chronologically. What I found was a pattern that stretched back over 70 years. The earliest document was a report from 1947, written by a ranger who'd been patrolling the area and had found a camp that appeared to have been abandoned in the middle of the night. The tent was still standing, the fire was cold but recent, and there were supplies scattered around the site. No permit had been filed, and no one ever came forward to claim the gear. The ranger noted in his report that the area had a heavy feeling and recommended avoiding overnight patrols there. In 1953, a search team had been sent out to look for a missing logger who'd been working in a nearby clear cut. They found him 3 days later, sitting near a creek, unresponsive. He was taken to a hospital and eventually recovered, but he refused to talk about what had happened. The search report mentioned that the team had experienced equipment malfunctions, compasses spinning, radios failing, and had noted an unusual silence in the forest. In 1968, a ranger submitted a resignation letter after only 3 months on the job. He'd been assigned to patrol the same area and had written that he couldn't continue working there due to persistent disturbances during night shifts. No details were provided and the resignation was accepted without question. The pattern continued through the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Missing hikers, abandoned camps, rangers requesting transfers, search operations ending in confusion or silence. The incidents weren't frequent, maybe one every few years, but they were consistent. And they were always in the same area, a section of old-growth forest, roughly 2 miles long and 1 mile wide, far from any major trails. I started cross-referencing the reports with topographic maps, trying to identify what made that area different. There was nothing obvious. No cliffs, no caves, no unusual geology. It was just forest, dense and old and remote. But as I dug deeper, I found something else. There were older maps from before the forest was managed by the Park Service, back when it was still logging territory. These maps had markings that didn't appear on the modern ones. Survey lines, logging roads, and a few scattered symbols that I didn't recognize. One of the symbols appeared repeatedly in the same area where the incidents had been reported. It looked like a circle with radiating lines. The same design I'd seen in a report from a maintenance crew in 2007. I didn't know what it meant, but I started looking for any historical context. I found a reference in a county archives database to a surveyor's journal from the 1920s. The surveyor had been mapping the area for a timber company and had noted several native markers carved into trees, which he described as warnings or boundary indicators. He didn't elaborate, and the journal ended abruptly with a note that the survey had been abandoned due to uncooperative conditions. I tried to find more information, contacted local historians, checked university archives, looked for any records of indigenous land use or cultural sites in that area. I found nothing definitive, just fragments, oral histories that mentioned certain parts of the forest being avoided. Old logging camp stories about workers refusing to enter specific sections. A few academic papers that referenced anomalous zones in temperate rainforests where ecological patterns didn't match the surrounding terrain. The more I learned, the more I realized that the pattern wasn't new. It had been there long before the Forest Service, long before the loggers, long before the first European settlers. People had been noticing that area and avoiding it for as long as there were records. I compiled everything I'd found into a report and submitted it to my supervisor. I recommended that the area be flagged for further study, that we review our patrol routes and search protocols to account for the historical pattern of incidents. He thanked me for the work, said it was interesting, and filed it away. I don't think anyone ever read it. I left the archives job 2 years later and moved to the coast. I still think about that area, about the pattern that runs through decades of reports, about the people who went in and didn't come out the same. I don't think it's a mystery that can be solved. I think it's just a place that shouldn't be disturbed, a place where the boundaries are thinner than they should be, and people who cross them pay a price. I don't go into the forest anymore. I stay where I can see the ocean, where the air is open and the light reaches the ground. The next case involves a ranger who thought he understood the wildlife patterns in his district until he found tracks that didn't belong to any animal he'd ever studied. I worked in the northern section of the Olympic National Forest from 2012 to 2018, primarily doing wildlife surveys and habitat assessments. My background was in ecology, and I'd spent years studying the fauna of the Pacific Northwest. Black bears, elk, cougars, bobcats, all the typical species you'd expect to find in a temperate rainforest. I knew their tracks, their behaviors, their ranges, and I was good at identifying signs of their presence. In the winter of 2014, I was conducting a survey along a remote creek drainage, documenting animal activity and checking trail cameras we'd installed to monitor elk movement. The area was about 6 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by foot, and it saw very little human traffic outside of the occasional research team. I was checking one of the cameras when I found the tracks. They were in a patch of soft mud near the creek, clear and fresh, probably made within the last 12 hours. At first glance, they looked like human footprints, bare feet, roughly the same size and shape as an adult male's prints. But as I examined them more closely, I realized they were wrong. The proportions were off. The toes were too long, the arch too pronounced, and the spacing between the prints was wider than it should have been for a normal human stride. The prints also went directly into the creek and didn't come out on the other side. I spent an hour searching the opposite bank, looking for where the trail continued, but I found nothing. It was like whatever had made the prints had walked into the water and disappeared. I took photos, made measurements, and noted the location in my field journal. I told myself it was probably just a distortion caused by the mud, that the prints had filled with water and shifted, creating the odd proportions. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was looking at something I didn't recognize. Over the next few weeks, I found more of the tracks. Different locations, always near water, always heading toward the creek or stream and then vanishing. I started documenting them systematically, taking detailed photos and measurements, trying to establish a pattern. The stride length varied, but the shape of the prints was consistent. Elongated toes, deep arch, no sign of shoes or equipment. I submitted my findings to my supervisor, suggesting that we might be dealing with an unknown primate or a human living off-grid in the backcountry. He reviewed the photos and the data and told me it was probably just barefoot hikers or someone walking through the area without a permit. He didn't seem concerned, but I kept finding the tracks and I kept documenting them. I also started noticing other things. Trees with bark stripped away at a height of 7 or 8 feet, far higher than a bear could reach. Branches snapped and arranged in patterns that didn't look natural, and areas where the undergrowth had been flattened in rough circles, like something large had been resting there. In the spring of 2015, I set up a series of remote cameras in the area where I'd been finding the tracks. I positioned them along game trails, near water sources, and at the edges of the flattened areas. I checked them every 2 weeks, swapping out batteries and memory cards, and reviewed the footage at the ranger station. Most of the footage was exactly what you'd expect: elk, bears, deer, coyotes, birds. But one of the cameras captured something I couldn't explain. It was a night shot, triggered by motion. The timestamp put it at 3 a.m. The footage showed a figure moving through the frame, tall and upright, walking on 2 legs. It was only in the frame for about 4 seconds, and the image was grainy, lit by the camera's infrared flash. I couldn't make out details, just the shape. Humanoid but wrong, too tall, too thin, moving with a gait that didn't look quite right. I replayed the footage dozens of times, trying to analyze the movement, the proportions, the way the figure interacted with the environment. It didn't match any known animal. It didn't match a human. It was something else. I submitted the footage to my supervisor along with all the documentation I'd compiled over the previous year. He reviewed it, consulted with a few other rangers and biologists, and the consensus was that it was probably a person, someone trespassing or living in the backcountry illegally. They suggested we notify law enforcement and have them patrol the area, but I didn't think it was a person. I'd spent enough time in the field to recognize human movement, human tracks, human signs. This was different. This was something that lived in the forest, something that had always been there, something that knew how to avoid being seen. I kept monitoring the area for another year, but I never captured the figure on camera again. The tracks continued to appear sporadically, always near water, always leading into the creek and vanishing. The stripped bark, the snapped branches, the flattened areas, all of it continued, and all of it remained unexplained. I left the Forest Service in 2018 and took a job with a conservation nonprofit in Seattle. I still think about the footage, about the tracks, about the figure moving through the frame. I've shown the video to colleagues, to biologists, to people I trust, and no one can give me a definitive answer. Some say it's a hoax, some say it's a person, some say it's an artifact of the camera. But I was there, I saw the tracks. I felt the presence of something in that forest, something that didn't want to be found. I don't go back to the Olympics anymore. I stay in the city where the only tracks are on the sidewalk and the only figures in the dark are people stumbling home from bars. It's safer that way. One last file, and this one involves the woman whose disappearance brought more questions than answers, even after she was found. I was part of the search and rescue operation in 2019 for a woman who'd gone missing during a solo backpacking trip in the Ho district. She'd filed a permit for a 5-day route through the interior, and when she didn't check out on schedule, her partner called it in. We mobilized immediately. The search followed the standard protocol. Teams covering her planned route, checking campsites, trail junctions, and water sources. We brought in dogs, helicopters, and additional personnel from neighboring districts. The weather had been good and the trail conditions were solid, so we expected to find her quickly. We didn't. We spent 4 days covering every inch of her route and expanding into adjacent areas. We found no gear, no tracks, no signs of disturbance. It was like she'd walked into the forest and vanished. On the afternoon of the 4th day, one of the dog teams picked up a scent near a creek about 3 miles off her planned route. We followed it into a section of old growth that was dense and difficult to access, and that's where we found her. She was sitting on the ground, leaning against a tree, her backpack beside her. She was alive, conscious, and uninjured, but she wasn't responsive. She stared straight ahead, her hands resting in her lap, and she didn't react when we called her name or touched her shoulder. We checked her vitals, gave her water, and tried to assess her condition, but she wouldn't speak. She wouldn't even look at us. We carried her out on a stretcher and transported her to the hospital in Forks. The doctors ran a full battery of tests and found nothing physically wrong with her. No dehydration, no injuries, no signs of exposure or malnutrition. She was in perfect health, but she wouldn't talk. She wouldn't explain where she'd been or what had happened. She just sat in her hospital bed, staring at the wall. Her partner arrived the next day and tried to get her to open up, but she remained silent. After 3 days, the doctors cleared her for discharge, and her partner took her home. The case was closed as a successful recovery, but I couldn't let it go. I'd been on dozens of search and rescue operations, and I'd seen people in all kinds of states, injured, exhausted, panicked, relieved. I'd never seen someone completely shut down like that. Not from trauma, not from exposure, not from anything the doctors could identify. It didn't make sense. A week after the search ended, I went back to the area where we'd found her. I wanted to see the site again, to try to understand what might have happened. I hiked in alone, following the same route the dog team had taken, and I reached the spot where she'd been sitting. It looked like every other part of the forest. A massive hemlock, a carpet of ferns, logs covered in moss. But as I stood there, I started noticing details. The tree she'd been leaning against had marks on the bark, faint lines carved in a pattern I'd seen before, a circle with radiating lines. The ground around the tree was flattened, not like something heavy had been placed there, but like the moss and undergrowth had been pressed down by something that had stayed for a long time. I walked in a widening circle, looking for other signs. I found more carvings on nearby trees, all the same pattern. I found areas where branches had been snapped and arranged in rough piles. And I found tracks. Not animal tracks, not human tracks, something in between, leading away from the site and deeper into the forest. I followed the tracks for about 100 yards before they disappeared into a creek. I stood there for a long time, staring at the water, feeling the weight of the silence pressing in around me. I didn't cross the creek. I didn't keep following. I turned around and hiked out. When I got back to the station, I filed a supplemental report about what I'd found. I included photos of the carvings, descriptions of the tracks, and a recommendation that the area be flagged for further investigation. I don't know if anyone ever followed up. A few months later, I heard from a mutual contact that the woman had started talking again. She told her partner bits and pieces of what had happened, but she refused to talk to anyone from the Forest Service or law enforcement. The partner told our contact that she said she'd gotten lost, that she'd walked for days trying to find the trail, and that she'd eventually given up and sat down to wait for rescue. But that didn't match the evidence. She'd been found 3 miles from her planned route, in an area that was difficult to access and had no trails. Her gear was intact, her supplies untouched. She showed no signs of having walked for days, and the area where we'd found her was marked in ways that suggested it was a place people had been avoiding or drawn to for a very long time. I think she saw something out there. I think she found something, or something found her, and whatever it was, it changed her in a way that she couldn't explain and didn't want to remember. I think she's trying to forget, and maybe that's the right thing to do. I left the Forest Service a year later. I took a job in search and rescue coordination, working from an office managing logistics and training programs. I don't go into the field anymore. I don't patrol, I don't search, and I don't spend nights in the forest. I've seen enough to know that there are places where the rules don't apply, where the boundaries between what we understand and what we don't are thinner than they should be, and where the people who cross those boundaries don't always come back the same. I still think about her, sitting against that tree, staring at nothing. I still think about the carvings, the tracks, the silence that pressed in around me when I stood in that spot. I don't know what's out there, and I don't think I ever will. But I know it's real, and I know it's been there longer than any of us. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening to Blacktop Files. These accounts come from men who spent years in the wettest, darkest parts of Washington state, and what they experienced out there stays with them. If these stories affected you, consider subscribing, turning on notifications, and letting us know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Stay safe out there, and remember that some places in this country don't want to be understood. They just want to be left alone.